So let's start off with cultural and begin with the struggles between Western culture and Islamic culture. And can we find a mending between Islamic and Western culture in the future?
So, I mean, yes, obviously, and no, obviously. So there's some things that it's difficult when you're growing up as a minority in general, whether you're Muslim or not, you immediately experience that there's something that's what's called like a dominant culture that's happening around you, right? So there's very obvious things like sports and music and, going out to the malls and movies and that kind of thing. There's that kind of immediate cultural experience that you happen with people around you, and what your friends are doing, how they dress, what they wear, how they talk. So there's that level of like tangible culture of things that you do on your day-to-day basis and like where you go for fun. And then there's the more what I would call like values, right? Values are things that are important to you as a person and to the society. So Islamically, even though one of the difficult parts is that Muslims are very diverse people. So you have people coming that are American, that are originally Indonesian, that are Egyptian, that are Afghan, that are, from West Africa, from Senegal, they're African Americans, they're a very wide spectrum of people. But the values sometimes come into conflict with what you believe as an American or as a Westerner. The very simple one is just the values of like individuality, right? Like whatever I want to do, I should be able to do, and no one should have the authority to be able to tell me otherwise. Whereas Muslims generally kind of have an attitude that kind of individuality or what you believe in should be restrained by a kind of framework of what's best for you, right? Your parents will always tell you like, no, I know what's best for you. So they'll try and restrict things you'll do or where you'll go or who you hang out with and different kinds of things like that. And that's oftentimes come into conflict. So, I mean, I think generally, of course, there's always ways that there's overlaps. And there's, many of us who grew up first generation in America have always had to kind of balance between like, what is American, what is my Muslim parts, what are, how do we kind of balance these two identities that we have, or multiple identities, so I'm like Afghan, but I'm also Muslim, and I'm also American, and I'm also like East Coaster. So for instance, like one of the interesting things you'll find is Muslims that grew up on the East Coast are very different than Muslims that grew up in the Midwest, or like Muslims that grew up in the West Coast, or Muslims that grew up in the South. So there's like regional identities, right? So there's like all these things placed on top of each other. Like one thing I just recognize, like even when you go to like California or somewhere, you see Muslims who grew up there, it's like a very different, very relaxed, like they're wearing t-shirts and sweatpants. And like, if you grew up on the East Coast, generally like my generation, when you go out, it's like you are presentable. You like look a certain, like you look like you're like
about to go to work, honestly.
Yeah, exactly. Like all the time, even like when you're hanging out with your friends, you kind of like dress up and, you not dress up fully like a suit, but like, you wear a button. Now you just look nice, you look presentable. And that's like an East Coast value, right? It's not like that on the West Coast or the Midwest. So even that is like cultural values that are specific to a region that are different than say. So yeah, that's a starting point.
So when it comes to, and this is probably one of the biggest things that I realized between Islamic and Western culture, is that both of them have these ideas about each other without ever really interacting that well. So you will find for example, the Western culture, they believe that Muslims tend to be more violent, or that they find Muslims to be more strict, or that Muslims, for example, do not coincide with democracy very well, and cannot live within a democracy. And that is because of their ignorance of Islam. But on the other hand, you find religious Muslims, especially religious Muslims, even living in the West, having the same ideologies about Western culture, saying, oh, it's not morally correct. Oh, they don't have any rights and wrongs, and so on and so forth. And you're kind of like, I mean, you guys both don't really see the beauty in each other at all.
Yeah, for sure. I would say that. So on one hand, these stereotypes that are developed, stereotypes generally are false, except there's like usually a grain of truth of something. So for instance, when Muslims look at the West, when we say Muslims, we generally mean like people who grew up overseas, right? And who have now come into the United States and who are like raising children there. People who like, served their first 2 decades or something in another, grew up their first 2 decades in a different part of the world. So that's what I'm talking about when I say those Muslims. There is this general mentality. For one, it's important to note that many people who are coming from these countries come from colonized countries. So their view of the West oftentimes comes from a view of people who have been bombing them, who have been taking away their culture, people who have been repressing them, people who've kind of destroyed their nations economically, politically, financially. And that's kind of their view of the West, is because of things that have been done to them. And so when people are coming to the West, there may sometimes be this perception of, negative stereotypes of people, that this is what they do, that they're going to take away your values and your culture and stuff. And similarly, it's funny, like on the other side, Western people too oftentimes will have this stereotype of Muslims that they're going to come in and take my culture and take my civilization and change things and bring in Sharia law and all this kinds of stuff. So on one hand, I think there's some grain of truth in the sense that there are nefarious, like there are very evil sometimes tendencies within individuals, but that's universal. Like there's evil people everywhere, within every religion, within every culture, within every civilization, that have negative attitudes. The problem is, I think, when those ideas become the dominant narrative about a people. So for instance, like Bernard Lewis, and he had this book about, Bernard Lewis is like a scholar in the early 20th century. He talks about like the problem of Islam, right? And then, what's the guy's name? Samuel Huntington. Samuel Huntington has this book, The Clash of Civilizations, where he talks about like there is Islam, there's the East, and then there's the West, right? And these guys are always going to have a clash of civilizations. And that has been disproved by many scholars because, one, what do you mean when you say the East? Like, you talking about Indonesia? Are you talking about Egypt? Are you talking about Afghanistan? Are you talking about Russia? Like, what does that mean? Each one of those have a very specific culture and very specific people. And even within them, there's very diverse kinds of people. Like, I'm from Afghanistan. My family's from Afghanistan. There's 13 tribes within Afghanistan. Which one are you talking about? Like, they speak different languages. They have different cultural customs. They come from different regions. Like, very different people within Afghanistan alone. So when you say the East, you're trying to group all these people, it's an imaginary construct. Like, it's not real. And when you talk about the West, what's interesting is very rarely will people ever talk about African Americans. No one ever talks about African Americans when we talk about the West, but they've been here for 400 years. They're definitely part of the West. So it's like, who do you mean when you say the West? Do you mean white people? Like, do you mean even within white people, are you talking about Southern white people? Or are you talking about like Northeastern white people? Are you talking about West Coast white people? They're all different. They have different cultures. They have different ideas. So what you see is like these categories become constructed of the East and the West as a means of power, right? As a means of keeping people in a certain way, or people who have a certain idea of what they want the world to look like. And many times those aren't real. Like, those don't exist in real life. But I'm trying to remember what your question was. I went too far down a rabbit hole.
No, you're going right.
What was your question again?
So what I was touching on is exactly that, the culture, the belief on both sides that their cultures cannot intertwine.
Yeah. So on one hand, there's this problem because, one, those categories don't exist in real life. Like, if you try to measure it any kind of objective way about, like, okay, how do you measure what this person's culture is? Do you measure it by their like beliefs about the next life? Do you measure it based on like, because within whatever category you create, Eastern, Western, Black, White, Northern, Southern, Arab, non-Arab, if you actually try to study those people, those categories fall apart because they don't actually exist in terms of like tangible, material, conversational levels. So on one hand, there has been people amongst the East, generally like in the Middle East, who may want to benefit from those kinds of categorizations of the West. And there might be people who might want to benefit in the West, policymakers, politicians, people in charge of different kinds of brands or institutions, or people who are professors writing books and such, that may want to benefit from those categorizations.